Hey everyone, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be talking about escaping the build trap, or how not to waste your time, money, and effort building things that don't matter. So why am I talking about this? Well, failed software projects lead to huge waste. To try and quantify this, all sorts of companies, consultant groups, etc. have tried to accrue the total damages, and studies in 2020 show it costs about $260 billion a year. And that if you actually look at the failure rate of these projects, about 70% fail one or more dimensions that they were set out to solve or achieve, and 24% just fail outright, never complete, never reach their goals. And so I don't know if these studies are true or not. I don't know if these figures are exact, but personally it doesn't really matter. My anecdata, what I've seen in my own career, is that a lot of projects shipped, but very few actually achieve the desired outcome. And so this is the question I want to tackle in this video is, how can we avoid building projects that either no one wants or just doesn't achieve what we set out to do? And to start this discussion, we've got to start with the build trap. Now, the build trap is a term coined by Melissa Perry and the book Escaping the Build Trap. And this is just a really common mode of failure that product teams fall into. And if we want to summarize it, basically it's when product teams or organizations start to prioritize building stuff over the actual impact of stuff. And I want to be clear here that building itself is not bad, right? The world and markets are constantly changing. That's one of the few facts of life, is that change will always happen. And software has proven that it's a scalable way to capture opportunities as it continues to eat the world. And then if we look at software teams, we are geared to actually build software. So it makes sense that building is our way of basically capturing this change, of capturing these opportunities in the real world. So we're not saying that building is bad, but we're really saying that building without impact, without a focus on the end, is typically going to lead to bad outcomes. And my asterisk here is that this is only when we actually care about ROI, which is most of the time, but if you're doing art or something, I guess it's priceless. And so I'm sure for a lot of people watching, you're well, this is so obvious, why are we even talking about this? But I think over my career, I've seen that we fall into this quite a lot, and it's not always in practice as easy to identify as it might look here in this presentation. So I want to give you a quick example of a build trap I see all the time, and that is when we quote unquote clean the backlog. And so this is something that product teams seem to want to do maybe once a year, once a half. They get this idea of oh, we have all these really cool things that we haven't gotten done because we didn't have time. Let's go through and do them. And so depending on the age of the team, on the size of the organization, these could be tasks that have just been sitting there for months or years that never got done. And this could number anywhere from the hundreds or thousands depending on your task management system. Now, by definition, if we think about what is in that backlog, these are all things that are just not important enough to do right now. At any one point in time, they just weren't the most important thing, and so they just never got done. And so if we scale that over time, what that really means is that these are all things that were just never important enough to do. Not just right now, but ever, in a whole series of present times. Now, this is for tasks with sufficient age. If you just put it on the backlog yesterday, maybe that's not true, but if that thing's been on there for several months, got to start wondering whether it's that important. And yeah, I see this all the time in product teams, and so this is a great example of how focusing on building things over the impact of things kind of creeps into company habits. And so the question then becomes, well, if we want to prioritize the impact of things over the building of things, then how can we transfer that focus to make sure that we're actually focusing on impact? And I think the simplest way to do this is to just really focus on a problem. And the reason that this is true is because problems have inherent value, right? The whole idea of a problem is that it's an obstruction to a real person or process from doing something they want to do in the real world. And so we can pretty easily quantify the value of doing this. It's the pain of the obstruction to that person or process from doing that thing. And the cool thing about being able to set a variable in a formula like this is that we can now start making estimates for everything else. And so once we can start making these estimates and building kind of a story around this, we actually start to see that we get a pretty lean, pre-validated business opportunity out of this. And so the market is clear. It's that obstructed person or process that's trying to do whatever thing they want to do. The value proposition is that we can solve that obstruction, that we can unblock that thing, and there's that inherent value associated with that. And then the offering that we can actually sell to person or process is whatever solution we can come up with that actually solves that obstruction. This is a very lean business case. And this isn't a new idea. This is literally what Y Combinator recommends to all of its cohorts. It's basically the second piece of advice that they give, and that is to build something people want. And if you go through their talks, the first learning is, what do people always want? And that is their problem solved. And so now that we know that we want to be focused on a problem, how can we make sure we're doing that in the real world, in our real product cycles? And I think the best way that I found to do this is to really just start with a hypothesis for every project. And this is basically something that we're stealing from science, right? They've spent centuries trying to figure out good ways to make sense of the unknown, to make predictions, and then understand if those predictions are accurate or not when they don't actually have any basis of truth. And if we kind of look at what we're trying to do in business, we can kind of see that it's similar, though we actually have, in many cases, a lot more answers, a lot more truths or evidence to go off of. And so we already talked about how, the world, the market is always changing, new opportunities all the time. And we know that we want to capitalize on it. And we have ideas to do this. But at the end of the day, we don't know for sure if any of these are going to work. Otherwise, we'd all be like billionaires and trillionaires, and that's just not the case. And so by having a hypothesis, we're now providing us a framework to actually test these ideas to know if we've got something good, if we should continue with it. And so when I think of hypothesis, what I think makes a good project hypothesis is to be very specific about why we're doing this work. And this allows us to better quantify what that impact is so that we can make a better decision of whether this makes sense or not. And so the first thing on there is what problem are we solving? And it should be very specific so that we can really point to real data showing that this exists, and we don't fall into the trap of just oh yeah, that sounds good, let's go build it, and then we realize oh wait, that was wrong. The second part is how do we know it's a problem? So again, that data of are there real events that showcases this? Does this happen at scale? And even better, who is having this problem? Do you know a specific person, event where this occurred? That's great, because then you can learn more from them. And then the final thing that I actually see a lot of people missing is, why does this make sense for our team to build, and often right now? Because if you think about it, there are infinite problems we could solve, but obviously we don't solve all problems. And that makes sense because most problems just aren't that useful to actually solve. And now if you can't do this, if you cannot answer these, then it's probably a trap, and you either need to do more research to see if you can find better answers for them, or having done some threshold of research and still can't solve it, do something else. And that's how we're going to try to avoid this trap. And another cool thing about doing this, about really defining the problem well, is that we're basically building boundaries on our context. We are narrowing the opportunity space in which we'll play. And a lot of studies have shown that having a set of boundaries, a box, if you will, we want to build inside of, this actually leads to better ideas for solutions. And the reason is that we're not just kind of randomly making ideas with no focus. We're actually focused on a specific point, solving that problem. And so as we ideate, we can kind of get a sense of whether we're getting, closer or farther away. And this is really contrasting with the kind of solution-driven development, which we often see in backlog-driven development, where we just have this idea that this could be a cool thing to build, but it's pretty rare that your first idea of how to do something is going to be the best way to actually do it. So focusing on the problem allows us to create an array of ideas, rank them all based on what's actually best for what we're trying to accomplish, and typically find a better solution to get that impact in the first place. Now, I wish that was it, that just a hypothesis is good enough to go off of, but at the end of the day, we still need to test the hypothesis. Right? The hypothesis is basically our plan for an experiment, but no matter how good it is, we still have to actually run that experiment to understand whether it was true or not and figure out where we can go in the next iteration. And the best thing I found to make these iterations fast and cheap is the creation cycle, which is essentially a simplified, applied, and generalized version of the scientific method specifically for the process of creation. And there's basically just 3 steps. The observe step, which is to understand the domain and your goals, what you're actually trying to get out of this. And this is what we'll be talking about all in this video, coming up with this hypothesis, really knowing what you're trying to solve and why. And then we come to the create phase, which is to actually build the experiments to test that understanding, to test your hypotheses that you've come up with, your ideas for capturing that opportunity in the real world. And this is where we are now, where we want to actually test the hypothesis, run that experiment, and gather results. But after you do that, as we have already talked about, there will be a lot of failures. And so you need to actually take those results and learn something from it so you can decide where to go from here. This is how we're getting the fast, cheap creation iterations. And I've talked about this a lot on the channel and on my blogs. So if you want to learn more, you can check out the link here and in the description. Now, one of the cool things about the simplified cycle is it makes it really clear how to plug in some of these best practices that everyone throws around how to iterate fast and cheap. Basically, how do we move fast and break things, but instead of break things, we want to learn things. And so a lot of people recommend like minimal viable products. I actually think that's a misnomer. And what you should really target is minimum viable experiments. And that's what we're trying to do in this create phase, where what is the minimum thing that we can build to effectively run an experiment against that hypothesis we created in the observe stage. If you focus on MVEs every creation cycle, then you're going to be iterating more effectively than most product teams out there. And what I want to leave you with is that, success is never guaranteed, right? We don't know for sure what opportunities are going to succeed, or we're all going to be billionaires, and we're just not all billionaires. But if you follow this idea of focusing on impact rather than building and running your product cycles like creation cycles with a clear hypothesis and fast, effective experiments, then you're going to make progress faster and cheaper than you were before, which at least increases your chance of success long term. Now, I love checklists, I love templates, and so of course I have a template for the project hypothesis I use in all of my projects. If you want to see what that looks like and use it for yourself, you can get it for free at creationcycle.xyz. This literally will link you to the Notion page I copy and paste into all of my projects. And so you'll get updates basically as soon as I make them. And another huge source of waste that I see in corporate environments is, of course, meetings. So if you're going to learn more about my strategies for making meetings more effective and less, a waste of time and money, you can check out this video for that. And that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions about building projects effectively, and definitely let me know if you have your own strategies that you found useful for reducing waste. As always, this is where you can find me on the interwebs, and that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.